we can all be hopeful. It's not some false belief that everything is going to be. It's an orientation of the spirit. It's standing in a hopeless place. And we can all choose to do the uncomfortable and inconvenient things that are necessary to create more justice.
Welcome back to a new season of America Who Hurt You. I'm Sarah Jones. It has been a while, and I hope you're hanging in there. If you are new here, I play characters from lots of different backgrounds based on my real family, my real life. And they used to be very vocal on this pod. But due to emergency circumstances like our democracy fully crashing out, you are going to be hearing less of the characters and more of my guests, more of me. But if you miss the characters, please jump in the comments on our Instagram and other social media at America Who Hurt You. Let us know and we'll respond. So if you're anything like me, you have probably been hurting a lot these days. And part of what's so painful is watching history repeat itself, the very worst aspects of our history. But part of what's been helping me is paying close attention to the heroes among us who are, even with everything that's happening, still bending the moral arc of our nation toward the greater good. Bryan Stevenson is one of those real-life legends. He's a world-renowned civil rights lawyer, prolific speaker, and author. You may know his book, Just Mercy, or the film based on the book in which he's portrayed by Michael B. Jordan. But as a civil rights attorney, Bryan has been fighting for decades for the rights of people who are the most marginalized. He's won multiple cases at the Supreme Court and helped save the lives of more than 140 wrongfully condemned people from death row. And he hasn't done it alone. Bryan is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, the EJI, which is based in Alabama. And together, they remind us of our history here in America, especially racial violence and terror, but in a way that allows us to heal from it. Now, you don't have to be world-renowned like Bryan to make a deep impact on your community or civil rights. Stay tuned for this deep, moving, and profoundly uplifting conversation with the one and only Bryan Stevenson. Oh, and before we get into it, if you enjoy this conversation or take anything from it that helps you get through these times, please support our show by sharing this episode, following us on Instagram and across social media at America Who Hurt You. And you can also subscribe to our Substack, Yes, I Am Sarah Jones. And also join us on YouTube where you can watch every episode this season. All of your support really helps the work we're doing here, and we'll make sure we get to keep doing it in the future. Now, here is my interview with the one and only Bryan Stevenson.
I want to get right into it. I feel like every second with you is so precious. And we have come to a place where this show, as much as I can make it, needs to be like a survival guide for some of us these days. How are we getting through the day? How are we getting through the week, much less 3 years and whatever the aftermath is? And Bryan, for people to get a chance to be proximate to you, which is one of my favorite words that you brought into my vocabulary, I wanted to start with, what is getting you through each day right now?
Well, I feel fortunate that about 13 or 14 years ago, I realized I wasn't going to find everything I was looking for to create the sort of justice, the sort of health that I think we desperately want in our communities and in our country by staying exclusively inside the courtroom. You know, I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I grew up in a community where Black children couldn't attend the public schools. I was raised by adults, none of whom had high school degrees because there were no high schools for Black people in our county.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Bryan, but for some of my listeners, that's going to sound like a history book that doesn't match the beautiful young man who is talking right now. So explain that better, if you don't mind. You're a beneficiary of Brown versus Education. Help us unpack that.
Yeah. So I grew up on the Eastern Shore, Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware in the 1960s. And when I was born, the schools were still racially segregated. They would not allow Black children to attend any of the public schools. My dad, who grew up in the same area, when he grew up, there were no high schools for Black people. Wow. So there was an elementary school that could get you to the 6th grade. But after that, if you didn't have the money or resources to travel 90 miles to Wilmington or to get to Delaware State, the historically Black college, you just couldn't go to high school.
Wait, I just need to say, for folks who maybe think the South,
Yeah.
And to them, the South is this deep, faraway place that they never touch. We're talking about Delaware. We're talking about the DMV,
Yes, that's right.
not far, right?
That's right. That's exactly
Wow,
right.
Maryland.
And that's just
Wow.
how insidious the narrative of racial hierarchy and racial difference was. It spread all through this country. It was codified in the South and the border states in these many places. But any state that enslaved people was a state that had been taught this idea that it wasn't safe to look at Black people as your equal. And so that was the legacy I was born into. Jim Crow laws existed. The theaters were segregated. The beach was segregated. Lawyers came into our community in the 1960s to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling, the 1955 ruling that racial segregation in education is unconstitutional. Despite the fact that that ruling came out a decade earlier, communities were still resisting. When they tried to integrate the schools in Milford, Delaware, there was just this horrific outpouring of rage, and mobs formed, and the kids had to leave those schools. So in the 1960s, it took lawyers to implement that ruling. And I think it's worth pointing out that my county was 80% white, 20% Black. If we had a vote on whether kids like me could go to the public schools, we would have lost the vote. It took a commitment to the rule of law for them to open up those public schools for kids like me. But it was transformational.
Wow.
I got to go to high school. I got to go to college, first generation college student. I wanted to go to law school because I knew that it was that rule of law that had changed things so fundamentally for me. And that has been my career. When I graduated from law school, I wanted to help the condemned. I wanted to help the marginalized. I wanted to help people wrongly convicted, unfairly sentenced, people who would always be disfavored, people who would never have the political power to protect their interests in the political process, but we could create rights. And so for almost 40 years, I've been trying to create rights for the poor, rights for the convicted, rights for the condemned, rights for children, rights for people who are disabled. And we've had a lot of success, banning the death penalty for people who are intellectually disabled, banning the death penalty for children.
And these are laws that exist now because of your work.
It's been really such a privilege to stand with people who are disfavored and marginalized and condemned, because what I've learned is that when you stand close to people who are condemned and hated, you can sometimes harness the power of grace and mercy and redemption, and something beautiful can be created from that. And moving this country to a place where it's less cruel, less inhumane, less harsh, has been part of what I think of as a real fulfillment of this kind of commitment. I want to give to the next generation what those lawyers gave to me by opening up those public schools. And that continues to be a big part of my work. But in response to your question, about 13 years ago, I began to fear that we were moving into an era where things were shifted, where we're not as committed to the rule of law. And as it turned out, we're now living at a time where I don't think we would be able to win Brown versus Board of Education. We do not have a Supreme Court that is prepared to do something that disruptive on behalf of the poor and disfavored people. And so that meant we were going to have to keep pushing in the court, but it would also meant that we would have to get outside the court and start doing what I call narrative work, changing the narrative environment so that our legal work can be as fully effective as I hope it to be. And I think that narrative work we've been doing now for a decade, for when we first met, for me going to TED and giving a talk, writing a book, all of that was part of a new narrative venture I would never have undertaken without that commitment. But doing this narrative work has been very, very energizing. Because in this moment in America, I think we're in the middle of a narrative struggle. And if we're not engaged in narrative activities, narrative combat, to use that metaphor, then we're going to feel overwhelmed, we're going to feel defeated, we're going to feel sidelined, we're going to feel silenced. But if we're actually active, if we're fighting, if we are responding, if we're doing the opposite of what others who are pressing these values that we believe in want us to do, then it feels like we're just doing what we were called to do, which is to struggle for justice.
So I want to ask you about that, because I got energized just hearing you say, when we get energized, I was like, yeah, yes. If you are the average person, and Bryan, I have been fortunate to be proximate to you, like you said, for, 10 plus years and 10 years now. And you are this kind of human reminder of so many things, compassion, empathy. You said something that moved me and changed me that I've never lost. And it actually helped inspire this podcast, that when you are allowing yourself, or, it's uncomfortable. You talk about the discomfort, right? That we have to experience if we're going to grow, if we're going to move past cruelty and shaming and blaming. You said something, I'm not going to say it as beautifully as you did, but something to the effect of, when you were proximate to somebody else's brokenness, whatever that brokenness is, that we've, come from this legacy of enslavement and terror, violent terror, can brutalize some of us disproportionately, whatever that is, it breaks us. There's brokenness there. And you said being proximate to these other people's brokenness was so important because it showed you your own brokenness. I cried. And I thought, oh my God, I have brokenness. It's not a moral failing. It's a product of, this society. And it's almost like the America we're in now is trying to pretend that it is unbroken and perfect, has never done anything wrong. And anybody that might be trying to speak up about injustice is the problem, and we need to erase it. How are you and your incredible organization, EJI, which I believe has been, I want to say the 1990s. Could you share more about that so ordinary people can go do their research, come visit you, how can we as regular folks get involved?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I do think the worst thing you can do when you're dealing with the weight of history, when you have been burdened by something that is unhealthy, that is destructive, the worst thing you can do is to pretend that it doesn't exist. Pretend that that's not a real problem. No one gets healthy if they have high blood pressure or if they have diabetes by pretending that they're not sick.
By like eating a lot more McDonald's? You mean that doesn't exactly cure your problem if you're sick?
That's right. Particularly when we know we can actually make you healthier. There are things you can do to actually become healthy, to stay healthy, despite the development of a disease or an illness. And we're prepared to, when we understand that it's our life that's at stake, our health is at stake, to do hard things. And I just think America has never been forced to confront the things that continue to make us unhealthy. And so our narrative work is really about that challenge. We've opened 3 sites here in Montgomery, and I want to invite everybody to come and visit us and visit our sites.
At the Legacy.
And people ask me, what can I do? I say, learning is an action item, and we feel like we're trying to create truth-telling spaces. So I invite everybody to come. We just opened a new convening in hotels. You can even stay in our space while you interact with our content.
Wait, there's a hotel now?
Yeah, it's called Elevation, and it's a space that tries to create a sanctuary so that people who are seeking this knowledge, who are on this pilgrimage, who are doing this journey, can be sheltered and comforted. And we have a restaurant and this amazing soulful cuisine, and we have a library where people can dig even deeper into the content. We have the creativity of the Black women in Wilcox County, Alabama, in Gee's Bend, who created these amazing quilts. Black women in that region were told, the only way you survive is to make yourself invisible. Stay silent. Don't interact with people who are white. And there was a reason why they were told that, because lynching and bigotry and exclusion was so pervasive that it was dangerous to be seen or to be heard. But these incredible, creative, beautiful human beings couldn't just deny themselves the ability to say something because they had so much to say. And so what they did was they poured their creativity, their brilliance, their genius into art, into the construction of materials, into cuisine and food. And these quilts that came out of Gee's Bend were so iconic and so extraordinary. They've now become major works of art. And what I love about them is that they're bold and bright. The colors are brilliant because unlike everything else in their life, in this space, they wanted to be seen. They wanted people to take, so you see bright purples and greens and yellows. They're vibrant, and the geometric figures demand your attention, which is a response to being forced to be silent and invisible. And so our hotel is draped with these images. And the first thing you see is the totem out front, which is to honor the Black women of Gee's Bend in this region, the Black Belt, which has created so much creativity and art and music and cuisine that this country enjoys but hasn't acknowledged. So yes, we want people to make the journey, and the quest we want people to join us on is just confronting the history of racial injustice, because I think that's what's holding us back. We, no matter where you live, California, New England, the South, Northwest, where if you live in this country, you live in a space where there's a long history of racial injustice. And for centuries, that history has accumulated. And I think it's created toxins in the air that make it hard for us to breathe in a healthy way. And we have conflicts and we don't trust one another because we've inherited this history of racial injustice. And for too long, we've just not talked about it. There are a handful of people who have talked about it. You've tried to talk about it. But our broader historical effort has been around silence rather than about exposure and honesty. And I think that has to change. And so we're trying to encourage people to talk about what happened to indigenous peoples before Europeans arrived.
Yes.
That the plight of Native people in this country is something we need to understand, because there were millions of Native people here before Europeans, and within a century, the population had been reduced to just a few 100,000 because this population was forced off their land. They were displaced. They were subjected to famine and disease, and all of these horrific things happened. We created our Constitution, which committed to equality and justice for all. At the same time, we were displacing millions of Native people, oppressing Native people, and the only way we could do that was to simultaneously create this narrative of racial difference. When we created our Constitution talking about equality and justice and liberty for everyone, we also created a narrative of racial difference where we excluded certain people. We said, oh no, those Native people, they're savages. They don't get the benefit of our commitment to equality and justice for all. And that racial analysis that excluded indigenous people set us up for a continuing struggle of harm. And now we see the footprint of all of that destruction on the reservations and the places. We see it in the data about health and abuse and alcoholism and all of these things. Well, it was that same narrative we used to justify 246 years of slavery. And the legacy of slavery still burdens everyone in this country, not just Black people, but we are all harmed by what happened during that 246-year period when all of these folks were subjected to so much horror, the abuse, the violence, the bondage, the sexual violence. But the great evil of slavery, from my perspective, wasn't the brutality of slavery, the violence of it. The greatest evil of slavery was the narrative we created to justify enslavement. Because the people who enslaved other people didn't want to think of themselves as immoral or indecent or unchristian. And how do you think of yourself as decent when you see the mother of 2 children being pulled away from her children, knowing she'll never see her children again because you've chosen to sell her for your profit? Well, the only way you can think of yourself as decent is if you create a false narrative. And we created a false narrative in America. We said that Black people aren't as good as white people, that Black people are less capable, less worthy, less human, less evolved. And that narrative gave rise to this ideology of white supremacy, of racial hierarchy.
Right.
And that narrative was so destructive that it survived the Civil War. And I often argue that the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war.
Take that in for a second. I know this is hard history to absorb, but it is so necessary. We're going to take a break, and then we'll be back with more of Bryan Stevenson. We're back with Bryan Stevenson, and he's taking us past the Civil War to the ways that civil rights for Black people finally start to emerge.
During Reconstruction, when we had a 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection of formerly enslaved people, and a 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote, we abandoned enforcement of those rights. We decided to side with those who were committed to racial hierarchy and racial hostility. And that's when the rule of law collapsed. Well, I was sensing something like that coming a decade ago.
Wow.
When our courts stopped doing what the law required because it was in conflict with these growing perspectives of not responding to injustice. And so this narrative work that we're engaged in because we feel like if we are not more honest about the demographic geography of America, which was shaped when 6 million Black people fled the American South during the first half of the 20th century, the geography of our nation has a huge connection to the institution of lynching and terror violence, because the Black people in L.A., the Black people in Oakland, the Black people in Detroit and Cleveland, Chicago, Minneapolis, most of the Black people in these communities didn't go to these communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to these communities as refugees and exiles from terror violence in the American South. And many of them left lands that they owned. They had to forfeit their opportunities to create wealth for their children and their grandchildren. So now we have a wealth gap that connects to race, but we don't acknowledge the roots of that gap being tied to this lawlessness, this mob violence that shaped the lives of African Americans. And then we codified racial segregation. And my parents were humiliated and degraded when they were forced to go through the back of doors and not be able to sit where they were. And I was born in a place where humiliation and degradation was something that Black people were supposed to accept. And those signs that said white and colored and all of that demeaning stuff, they weren't just directions, they were assaults. They created injuries. There were wounds and scars that were created by that. And we've never talked about the harm of segregation. We've never talked about what we have to do to heal from all of that humiliation and degradation. We just tried to move on as if somehow it wasn't a big deal. And so here we are now in this modern era where people are trying to pretend like we've never done anything wrong, when in fact we've never confronted the wrong that we've done. So for me, this moment is about pushing our nation to confront the harms of our history and to do it with honesty, not because we want to punish them. I don't talk about slavery, lynching, and segregation because I want to punish America. I talk about these things because I want to liberate us. Yes. I want us to be unburdened in future generations from this history. I want us to get to the kind of freedom that we all talk about, but we can't get there by pretending like heart disease and high blood pressure and diabetes, that the illness doesn't exist. We can't get to a healthy place by pretending. We have to have the courage to confront what ails us, treat it, and then get to the better place. And the good news is that treatment is possible. We can do what we need to do. And you and I have seen that in places all over the world.
Yes. And I want people listening to have a sense of the hope that you are, you're pointing us toward. If you are, unable to get up and walk around because your high blood pressure and whatever, you would go straight to the doctor and you wouldn't say, oh, doctor, don't just take my blood pressure or anything. Don't take my temperature. I don't want you diagnosing me. I just want you to fix me, or I'm just going to pretend I'm fine and then walk out of here. And that's our agreement. Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing I get from you is that it's so worth the discomfort. We're so uncomfortable in this society. This term of wokeness, which I think is a euphemism. People don't want to say, and you say it so beautifully, inclusive is just a way of saying, tell the truth. Yeah. Tell the truth that DEI isn't there to give anything to anybody who doesn't deserve it. You've said this so beautifully. It's there to repair the fact that we've been here, talented. I think it's your great grandfather wasn't allowed to read or something like that and taught himself anyway and then helped others. Like, we have always been those people, those incredibly excellent people who rise in spite of what's being imposed on us. And yet the mythology is we're being given handouts somehow. Can you help people have hope around how to talk to their anti-woke relatives or whatever that is?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, Sarah. And I think we're now in this really scary era where when you go to the doctor with high blood pressure or diabetes or, God forbid, cancer or some other really serious illness, we have government officials that are trying to ban doctors from telling you that you actually have those diseases. That's what they're doing when they say, don't be honest, don't do truth. We're going to make it harder for the physician to do that. And of course, if you can't talk honestly, then you're not going to get better. I think it's worth contextualizing why we're here at this moment, because when you're enslaved, you have to focus on freedom. And so the generations that were fighting during that time period, Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, they had to focus on freedom, because without freedom, you can't have the other things. And then after emancipation, when Black people were being terrorized and threatened with so much violence, and the mobs would pull people out of their jails, pull them out of their homes, or whole communities were being burned to the ground just because some Black person achieved something, we had to focus on security. Because without security, your rights won't matter. And so we spent the first half of the 20th century just getting to a place where there was a little bit more security. Black women and men joined the armed forces, and they helped the United States defeat the forces of fascism in Europe in World War I and World War II. And that empowered us to get to a better place so that the security was a little bit better. It was no longer acceptable for a mob of thousands to gather without any threat of being held accountable. And so that's what then opened the door for our courageous parents and grandparents to begin the civil rights movement. And when you're enslaved, you have to focus on freedom. When you're threatened, you have to focus on security. And when you have no rights, you have to focus on the establishment of civil rights. And so our activism at the end of the 20th century was about tearing down the legal architecture of Jim Crow and segregation. It was about creating the right to vote. You had millions of Black people disenfranchised. We weren't participating in this political process. And we've made tremendous progress in that effort. But now we're in this point where we have to do the narrative battle. This is the
Bryan, they are saying states' rights
out loud again on
That's right.
CNN. They are
That's right.
actively undermining like our right to vote.
That's
is
right.
like no. They're basically like, well, let's just cross that out
That's
along with the other stuff we're erasing.
That's right. And in many ways, it's not our responsibility, but we've made it too easy for people to maintain this narrative by not insisting that there be more accountability. Mr. Fred Gray is a lawyer who represented Rosa Parks and Dr. King. I'm going to be with him tomorrow. He turns 95 next week. He's such a legend, such a champion. And I joke with Mr. Gray. I said, Mr. Gray, if I find a time machine, I want us to go back to 1965. And he laughs, and he says, what are we going to do? I said, when we get back to 1965, after they pass the Voting Rights Act, we're going to insist that there be some accountability, that we hold accountable these states that disenfranchise Black people for a century. We're going to make these states that have excluded us and disfavored us be accountable. And because he and I are both lawyers, he knows, like I know, that when you go to law school, the curriculum is really not about what's a violation of the law. That's pretty clear. The curriculum is really about how do you remedy a violation of the law. And we have an elaborate system of remedies in America. When corporations violate the law, when taxpayers violate the law, when contracts are broken, we have a whole elaborate regime of damages. There's actual damages. There's punitive damages, which we will sometimes impose to disincentivize bad behavior. There's even a concept of treble damages.
What's that?
Somebody $1 million, you actually have to pay $3 million because we're trying to disincentivize that kind of mistake again. And nobody thinks it's radical. Nobody thinks it's woke. Nobody thinks that it's some kind of extreme thing. It's what the law requires. And we apply that to corporations. We apply it to taxes. We apply it to every aspect of harm except civil rights. And I want to go back to 1965 because I think the states that disenfranchise Black people should do more than say, oh, we're not going to do it again. And they didn't even say that because every Southern legislator voted against the Voting Rights Act, voted against the civil rights. They didn't even have to say, we're not going to do it again. We just acted as if somehow that with these laws, so there would be no more problems. And that was a mistake. And what I want to do is go back to 1965 and with regard to the Voting Rights Act, say, oh, it's not enough that we have the federal government trying to protect us. The state of Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi, all these states that disenfranchise Black people should automatically register every Black person when they become of age. We made registering to vote dangerous and threatening and menacing to Black people for decades, but we expected them to go register with no protection on day one. Why not force these states that have disenfranchised people to automatically register Black people as a part of the remedy for 100 years of disenfranchisement? I don't think it would have been wrong to say, you know what, on election day, you all have to go into the Black community and get their votes. I don't even think in 1965 it would have been crazy to say, you know what, on election day, Black people get to vote twice. And while I'm kind of joking,
I'm right here.
It's not inconsistent with what we do in other areas of the law because we should be thinking about how are we going to repair that. And what breaks my heart, Sarah, is if we had done that in 1965, you know what, we might be some kind of new free in America. We'd be experiencing something so much more joyful, something so much more energizing. We wouldn't be actually constantly still fighting to just hold on to that little thing, which is what we're now doing. We'd be someplace better. All of us, black people, white people. And because we were unwilling to repair the harm, now what you see is a continuation of people trying to get us back to that same place. So that is why I believe we have to insist on, first of all, understanding the harm, talking about it, and then committing to what needs to happen. And there are models. You know, if you go to Berlin, Germany, you can't go 200 meters without seeing monuments and memorials and the Stapelstein, these stones that are in the ground to honor the victims of the Holocaust. The Holocaust Memorial sits in the center of Berlin. Every student in Germany is required. You can't graduate from high school without a detailed understanding of the Holocaust. There are no monuments to the perpetrators of the Holocaust in Germany. The exact opposite. And their leaders aren't saying, oh, we can't teach our children about the Holocaust. That might make them feel uncomfortable or ashamed. They're in a very different place. And because of that, the villain of the 20th century has become one of the heroes of the 21st century. It's not perfect.
Right.
But they've done some things in less than a century that we have never done. And I just think that has to be what we offer people. We created our sites not because we want to bring people down. They're challenging. We don't try to sugarcoat it.
It's not Disneyland, y'all.
It's not Disneyland. Just like
Yeah.
you don't want your doctor to tell you oh, it's not that bad, but you got cancer. It'll probably be all right. No, if it's a life-threatening cancer, you need to know that.
That's right.
Because the treatment can be hard and challenging. But you will do chemo. You will do radiation. If you know on the other side of that, you can get your health back. You can have your life back. And that's why I think we do need an era of truth and justice, truth and repair, truth and reconciliation, truth and restoration, truth and redemption. But those things are sequential. A lot of people want to just jump to the R words. But it doesn't work like that. You got to do the truth-telling first. And what's powerful is that, many of us come from faith traditions. That's what we've been taught. And at least in my church, you can't come to my church and say, well, I want salvation, redemption, and heaven, and all that good stuff, but I don't want to admit to anything I've done bad or wrong. The clergy in my church will say, oh, no, I'm sorry, son. It don't work like that. So you're going to have to repent. You're going to have to confess. But they'll tell you, but don't be afraid. Because repentance and confession is what opens up your heart. That's what allows grace and mercy to come in. And on the other side of confession and repentance, you actually feel something lighter. You become unburdened. You are lifted. And our nation has not been lifted up because we haven't had the courage, to be honest. And so rather than trying to pretend like we don't ever have to do that, we ought to be doing the opposite. And the challenge we have in America is that unlike in South Africa, where a black majority took over and committed to truth and reconciliation, unlike in Germany, where the Nazis lost the war, unlike in Rwanda, where military intervention flipped who had power to deal with that genocide, power has never shifted in this country. The people who benefited from enslavement, the people who benefited from terror violence and lynching, the people who benefited from segregation, the people who benefited from mass incarceration, are the people who still largely have power. So we have to engage in a different kind of change. Our change has to be moral. That's what Dr. King understood. The civil rights movement knew they never would have the political power, the economic power, the military power to change. So they had to have moral power. Dr. King committed to nonviolence because there's power in that. And I embrace that. I just believe that these people who glory in violence, glory in bigotry, characterizing whole nations as garbage, demeaning people because of their ethnicity or their heritage, trying to kind of advance this idea that you're strong means you can abuse other people. And all of that, I think we have to reject and come back to the kind of truth that have allowed us to do the things that we do. And that's simply what energizes me, is to know that, I continue to believe. I read all this Russian literature when I was in college, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and French literature, Victor Hugo. And the consequence of that is that I just believe that truth crushed to earth will rise again. I don't believe that lies and abuse and bigotry and violence is more powerful than the beauty of truth, the beauty of care and love. I think those forces are so much more powerful. And that's why I don't think we should shy from acknowledging the harm.
And now we know why Bryan Stevenson has the distinction of receiving the longest standing ovation in TED Talk history. We will be right back with more. Stay with us. We're back with Bryan Stevenson, civil rights lawyer, narrative warrior, and one of my favorite human beings on the planet.
You were speaking, Bryan, about people being torn from their mothers and sent away and they'll never see them again. And that is happening right now with ICE, right? As you were saying that and my heart was heavy, I then was reminded, Bryan isn't some, superhero, supernatural person. You can be Bryan. Everybody listening, you have Bryan Stevenson DNA in you. And I want us to not just read his book and, like his TED Talk, or not just be inspired by the work he's doing with EJI and go on down to Montgomery. While people are trying to scrub the truth from websites, you can't deny the truth right there for you to face and walk through. And what do they say? Feel, deal, and heal.
Yeah.
If you go down there and feel it and then stay in the beautiful hotel. And as you were talking about the gorgeous art and the color, I thought, yes, what a perfect metaphor to get away from this, false narrative of black and white. And let's get into the vibrant color, right? We can do this, y'all. And Bryan reminds us, we've been here before. Maybe not us, but Bryan, thank you for sparking the fire in me that burns brighter than, the dark places that we can go in a time like this.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, Sarah, but you're absolutely right. All of us, anyone who's listening to this, anyone can get close to the poor, the disfavored, the marginalized. You can go into places where people are falling down and you can be proximate. You can actually stand next to people who are sometimes overwhelmed and threatened. The story I like to tell is when integration came to our community, my grandmother was the force in our family. She was the quintessential African-American matriarch. She was tough, she was strong, but she was kind and she was loving. And she was a force of nature. She was the end of every argument in our family. She was the start of a lot of arguments in our family. And because she never lived through integration, when integration came to our community, I don't think she knew quite how to protect me. So she started doing this thing that I didn't understand at the time, but whenever she would see me, she would just come up to me and she would grab me and hug me so tightly. I actually thought she was trying to hurt me. And then she would let me go. And usually an hour later, she would see me and she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again and hug me some more. And so by the time I was 9 or 10, I'd figured out every time I saw my grandmother, the first thing I would always say is, "Mama, I always feel you hugging me." And she'd smile this smile. She worked as a domestic her whole life, lived into her 90s, but then fell down one day in her 90s and broke her hip. And then she was diagnosed with cancer. And I was in college at the time, and I went to go see her. And I knew that she didn't have much time, but I went into the bedroom. She was on her bed. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't responding. And I got it into my head that my grandmother couldn't die if I was talking to her. So I sat down, and I was prepared to talk forever. And I just started talking, and I was saying nonsensical things, but I was just talking. And finally, one of my relatives came in and said, "Bryan, you can't just stand here and talk forever. You need to say goodbye." And I just didn't think I could, but I tried, and I just said, "I'll just leave." And I stood up, and I was about to leave. But before I left, my grandmother opened her eyes, and then she reached out and she grabbed my hand. And the last thing she said to me, she said, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And then she said, "I want you to know I'm always going to be hugging you." And there have been so many times in my life when I feel like I have felt the embrace of my grandmother. And I share that story because no matter who you are, no matter what you do, no matter where you are, you have the ability to get proximate to someone who's overwhelmed, someone who falls down, someone who's disfavored, someone who's burdened. And if nothing else, you can wrap your arms around them and affirm their humanity and their dignity. And justice begins when we affirm the humanity and the dignity of all of God's children. Any policy that doesn't recognize and affirm the humanity and dignity of every one of God's children is a policy that we need to correct, a policy that we need to change. We can all be truth tellers. We can all be hopeful. Now, hope is not something that you have to have money to acquire. In fact, it sometimes is the thing that can get you through when you have no money. Hope is available to every one of us. It's an orientation of the Spirit. It's not some false belief that everything is going to be. It's an orientation of the Spirit. It's standing in a hopeless place. And we can all choose to do the uncomfortable and inconvenient things that are necessary to create more justice. 3 years ago, we started an anti-poverty initiative at EJI. And a lot of people were saying, oh, it's going, y'all haven't done this before. It's not. I said, yeah, but that's what I think we should do. The pandemic exposed real inequalities and in this region in particular, the Black Belt of Alabama. So we started working on food insecurity. We decided to start giving families, caregivers, debit cards, $415 a month for at least 6 months to help them manage food insecurity. Then we bought a mobile grocery, and we started going into communities selling these grocery items at very discounted prices. And now we've worked with over 7,000 families, and it's been the most energizing and inspiring thing for my staff. My staff were nervous at the beginning, like, how are we going to do this? Now they fight each other over who gets to go out in the community with it, because it's the most gratifying thing. People come up to you and express their love, their gratitude, and it's been so beautiful. And you learn things. Older woman told me, I said, we allow people in the program to identify other folks in their community. We say, is there anybody that needs this more than you do? And you won't lose yours, but is there anybody? And people are eager to identify people who need it more than they do. And this older Black woman came up to me, she said, you know what I love most about this program, Ms. Stevenson? She says, I love that I get to help other people. She said, just because you're poor doesn't mean you don't want to be generous. I love being generous. She said, I've always wanted to be a philanthropist, and now I'm a philanthropist. I'm identifying people who are going to get donations. And that's the power, that's the beauty that comes out of proximity. It comes out of truth-telling. It comes out of hopefulness. And it's all there for us. We just have to kind of take advantage of it. And we can't, as they say in the civil rights movement, let nobody turn us around. Just because they're making threats about this, I told people we didn't take any federal money when we built our sites. And they can't withhold anything from us that they gave us because we didn't take any. And I love saying it like that. We didn't take a penny of state or federal money. We were never offered a penny of state or federal money, which is more accurate. But still, we're going to be even louder if people are saying, be quiet. We've got to be even bolder if people are saying, don't talk about that. We've got to be even more committed to this. And I feel really strongly about that. But I also feel strong in doing it. Because now I've started telling myself I represent the 10 million Black people who endured the immense suffering and constant sorrow of slavery in this country. They are my foreparents, but they are my clients, and they are standing with me. The millions of people who endured the segregation and the humiliation and degradation of that era, they're with me. The millions of family members who have lost their loved ones to wrongful convictions and excessive punishment in this carceral era, who have been abused in jails and prisons, these are the people who I feel like I'm standing with when we try to do these things. And you start to feel like you're part of this army rooted in truth-telling. And that's what allows you to kind of make that commitment. We're not going to turn around. We're just not going to turn around. We don't care what powerful people say, what powerful people want, what powerful people do. We think the power of justice, the power of truth, the power of grace, the power of mercy, the power of love is a greater power to be aligned with, and that's where we're going to stand.